Okay, let's see if we can figure this out. Surprise, surprise, it's acrylic paint. Okay, let's go ahead and separate this out by 8 sections. That should be more than enough room for all the tests I want to run. So this first one might sound silly, but I'm going to try out just plain water and see if that stains the paper in any way. Going to be putting down coffee in this one as a base reference, some gouache paint in this top left, regular watercolor in the top right, some wood stain down here, and I'm going to do it at 100% opacity and then a watered down version, just to get a variety. And for the fun of it, let's try out shoe polish. Let's just see if that works. I have my doubts, but you never know. And then here we're just going to try out different opacities of acrylic paint. Some of it watered down and then some of it extremely opaque. This one might be a bad idea, but I'm going to go ahead and test out oil as well. Just trying to test out a few things just to see what works. Now that everything's dry, let's go ahead and add some UV paint to all these to see how well they show up. Oh, hang on, I thought that was dry. So after drying the page a second time, let's go ahead and finish off that test. And I'm just drawing little smiley faces with that UV pen. This will represent all the finer lines that I'll have to use with the UV pen. And because I'm using a pen and a little jar of paint, let me go ahead and add that as well. I'm going to be adding a generous amount too, because if this doesn't show up on the black light, then this really doesn't work out. And I think just a single line is plenty for this. So after reviewing everything, some of them actually did surprise me. For example, that oil, you can barely see it at all. And surprisingly, the watercolor did terrible too. But in the end, acrylic and wood stain are going to be my best bet. Now, neither one stain as well as that coffee, so I'm still going to use the coffee, but I'm going to try to limit the areas that I'm using it in. And you can see right there that oil did spill through the page too, so that would have been a really bad idea. So let's go ahead and start working on that Polaroid. I'm going to draw out the water tower, some of the buildings on the left, some of that canyon in the background, plenty of trees, and I'm thinking the rest I can get with paint. Now I have a couple guidelines here just to let me know how far I need to take that paint. And I'm going to be using leftover gouache paint. Water looks worse than the coffee. Now because this does take a while, I'm just going to speed through it really quickly. And I'm just trying to get a general idea for this. Since it is going to be a really damaged Polaroid, just a faint image of this is all I really need. And I'll just slap a filter on top of it before I print it. So nothing really has to be perfect. So if you notice, my paint actually spilled over, so there's no F on that GravityFalls. But I don't think anyone will notice. So after adding a filter, I'm going to go ahead and print out the image. And I'm using photocopy paper, by the way. Get out the old cutting board. And let's go ahead and cut this down to size. Try and do my best right now to slow down the footage, just so that these videos don't go so quickly. But at the same time, not trying to also show every little bit of the process. Otherwise, these videos would be 2-3 hours plus. Nothing really exciting would be happening. Gonna go ahead and put this away back in its corner and then get out the old coffee. You know this is the same coffee, I just keep adding water to it. Let's go ahead and dip in our image and we're just gonna let it soak for a while. And just to add a little extra texture, I'm gonna pour on a little extra coffee on top. This will just add different dark spots onto the image. Almost like the image has been through rain and been burned, just so that it looks extremely old. So now that I've let it sit for about 10 minutes, I'm going to go ahead and try to wash off all that excess. And you can see here I have a little too much on this image. So I'm going to go ahead and try to wash off some of that extra the best I can. Going to put the coffee off to the side for another image. And you don't want to speed up the drying process. Letting it dry naturally is going to give it that really crusty looking feel to it. And really give that coffee a chance to crystallize. So it's been about 9 hours, so let's go ahead and start tearing this image apart so that it can resemble the Journal 3 version. I'm going to tear off the top right corner, and for the top left, I'm going to have to be careful because I need to save these pieces right here. Because it almost looks like it's ripped and then maybe taped back together. So that's going to be my plan, is just to tape this back together afterwards. Now by adding a little bit of coffee to the corners, this will really help separate it and really show off those rips. Even through the tape, you'll be able to see it. So now that that's done, we can go ahead and let it dry off on the side. I'm going to try my best to sketch out these designs. This top left one kind of looks like a little bit of a maze, And then it has like an eyeball facing forward, facing a triangle. That could be referencing something. Let's do the one on the bottom right. That's going to be a bunch of little symbols. So when drawing the bat face next to it, I'm going to hold the Polaroid there just so that I know I'm not going to cover this image. So none of these sketches actually have to be perfect. Since it is supposed to look homemade and drawn on the fly, you do want to make sure they look a little crude. So now that everything's sketched out, I'm going to go ahead and start darkening up everything. And again, I'm just using a regular pen, no special pens here. And this is just to give it that more homemade look. Now for any drawing on the corners, it's best to add something underneath your hand. That way it makes it a little easier to draw. Otherwise your hand's going to be at a weird angle. Now I did forget to add that white beforehand, but it's going to be fine. I'll just add it on after this and then touch up those black lines afterwards. Now right here I'm using wash paint just to stain the paper a little bit there. Now it's not going to be the best for holding that UV paint, but after reviewing what I could find, there's not going to be anything UV written there. So it should be okay to use my preferred paint. So again right here, just trying to make everything look a little sketched out and nothing too fancy. A little bit of coffee just to mess up the drawing a little bit. This will help add a little bit of texture to that image. Now I did actually finally get a red pen, so now I don't have to be too careful with how hard I push on that paper, because that Sharpie did bleed through ever so onto the other page. Right here, just going to add in all the cursive, and I am finally getting back into the groove of writing in cursive, so this is starting to look a little bit nicer. It's been quite a few years since I've used cursive, so my cursive's been a little weird, and not as good as it could be. Now here, I did run into a problem with that UV, because I did add that coffee, and I didn't realize there was going to be UV drawings right there. So it doesn't really show up as well as I had hoped it would, but that's just a lesson learned. So before I start weathering the page, I'm going to actually write out that whole message first and then try to strategically work around it so I can avoid messing it up the best I can. And for weathering this time, I'm going to actually use watered down acrylic. Now it's not as good as coffee, but that message did end up reading a lot better. So this is probably going to be the route I choose instead of coffee. And again, since these corners aren't going to have any UV messaging, I can actually use coffee for this part right here. That way the pages stay consistent from one to the other. And that right there is just me checking to see how far I can take the coffee before it spills into that message. And every time you see me pull that journal away, it's actually just me using a hairdryer in a different room, just so I don't have to wait for it to naturally dry. So right here, just doing any little touch-ups that I missed, or anything that's not showing as good as it should. In some spots, correct it a little easier than other spots. That's probably because of the materials that I'm using. And it might be a little difficult to see on camera, but comparing one side to the other, the UV messaging is showing up significantly better on this page now. So right here, I'm going to tape up the image back together, and I find this method works really well. And just to make sure this doesn't fall apart, I'm going to add a second piece of tape to the back of this, just so that it holds a little bit better. And then we're going to tape the image in, and we should be right as rain. And I think that UV message showed up significantly better. Not perfect, but better. You know, I thought I had too much light in this room. I completely forgot to turn off the light above my head. Oh well.